Could the symbolism behind an ancient Galilean wedding prove the rapture of the church and that the rapture will happen before the tribulation? Stay tuned as we ask an expert. Folks, I'm so happy to have Brent Miller Jr. with us. He's a filmmaker. He's made this video, Before the Wrath, and he is an expert in subject matter related to the rapture and Bible prophecy. Brent, so good you could join us on Prophetic Perspectives.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, folks, if you haven't seen Before the Wrath yet, it is an excellent video, and it uncovers what was considered a mystery in the Bible at the time, the Galilean wedding. Brent, what's so significant about a Galilean wedding versus a regular Jewish wedding?
Yeah, well, unlike the regular Jewish weddings of the time of Christ in the first century, his first coming, the Galileans did things a little differently than what they did in kind of the religious epicenter around Jerusalem, especially in their wedding practices. And we need to remember that Jesus wasn't just a Jew, he was a Galilean. So he understood the culture, and also his disciples, other than Judas, were all Galileans as well. So when he spoke to them using parables and examples and to try and teach them spiritual truth, which Jesus often did through parables and stories and examples of day-to-day living, like be fishers of men. You know, unless you were a fisherman, you wouldn't understand the connection. Yeah. So when he spoke to his disciples, and specifically to his disciples, he spoke to them as Galileans. There was a difference. And when it came to their Jewish weddings, there's so many things that he did to relate to them that followed their Jewish wedding culture that they would have understood probably in more depth than anyone else in Israel or the region. Like, for example, in the region, when you had a betrothal, generally you knew the date that wedding was going to happen. You know, it'd be about a year from now. We need to make preparations, and you have a lot of these kind of Jewish wedding, return of Christ parallels. But to the Galileans, it meant a lot more, because in the Galilean culture, the groom would actually come for the bride, for just one of many examples, in the middle of the night, which was very unique to the Galilean culture. So now we in hindsight, we look at all the scripture in the New Testament regarding being the bride of Christ, having enough oil and your lamps lit, waiting for the groom. In Revelation, you have the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so it's all of these wedding analogies that spoke directly to the Galilean culture.
Wow. Well, for the folks here, take us from the beginning. How does a Galilean wedding differ? And as we go through the steps, quickly, just tell us what are the parallels to the rapture.
Yeah, well, there's a few that jump right out. Right at the very beginning, you have the groom in a regular betrothal. The groom offers the bride a cup of wine, and it's up to her and her alone. She has all the authority to accept and receive that cup of wine. And by taking a drink, she is receiving the groom and accepting the betrothal, accepting the covenant. And the wine was a symbol of covenant. It was a promise that that's how they would seal the covenant.
And that reminds me of the Last Supper. Right?
Exactly. And then you look at the parallel, Jesus at the Last Supper with the cup of wine, creating a new covenant with his disciples. Of course, they understood exactly what he was doing. This was not a mystery to them. In fact, I couldn't imagine them really connecting to Jesus on any other level other than their wedding analogy, because that's what you would do to create a covenant, especially in a marriage.
But they weren't they were married, but not officially married yet, right?
Right.
At that point?
In the wedding custom, they were married from that point, but they weren't together. They weren't, unlike today, we get married and go on the honeymoon and that's it. But in the first century, they were married under a real covenant before God, right? So they were technically married and one, but they didn't live together for at least a year. They had to actually stay apart. In fact, even at this point, it was considered pretty taboo for the two to even be together. They actually were separated because the marriage wasn't consummated, and they weren't allowed to live together.
So it sounds like the church age where Jesus is up in heaven and we're here waiting for him to come back.
Exactly.
The groom is waiting for the bride at some point. What is the groom doing, by the way, during all this time period?
Yeah, well, right after the betrothal, the groom would leave to prepare a place for his bride.
Just like Jesus said in John 14, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the groom would have to build onto his father's house. So the bride and the groom would live essentially as a room that was built onto the father's house. And so that's why it's interesting that Jesus says, in my father's house are many mansions. And some anthropologists looking at the first century context actually believe it's more accurate that Jesus said, in my father's house are many bridal chambers. So there's some debate amongst the hermeneutical translation of this. But nevertheless, it's still the same point that the bride is going to be brought to the Father's house. So again, Jesus is following this parallel step by step.
Matthew 24, he says, but of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only. Speaking of when Jesus comes to rapture the church, we don't know when that's going to happen, but it was the same for the wedding, right? The groom didn't know when. Who is the one who knew that it was time to go get the bride?
You're right. The bride and the groom did not know the actual hour of the wedding ceremony. Okay. The only person that knew in the entire town, of any town in Galilee, was the father of the groom. Okay. The one who actually found the bride for his son, the one that read the conditions, the one that provided anything that needed to be provided, who's overseeing the preparations. And because remember, it's his house that's being built onto. He has full view of everything going on. And when everything is set, so, you may not know the day or the hour, but you know the season. You get a kind of a feel, things are getting done, food's being ordered for the feast. So the town generally knows that something's about ready to go, but only the father knows the exact moment that he's going to say, son, go get your bride. Wow. And I don't find it a coincidence at all that Jesus says that he doesn't even know the day or the hour, only the Father. And he's speaking to his Galilean disciples. I mean, the parallels are too perfect.
That's amazing. And then you mentioned before the wrath, when the groom does take a procession to get his bride, he blows a trumpet, just like in the rapture, and he takes his bride, he carries her back to the Father's house. Let's end with this, the wedding feast. What is the significance of the marriage supper?
Well, what's so incredible about the marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation and in comparison to the wedding feast in Galilee is that this wasn't just a one-day wedding feast, where everyone comes and goes home later that night. This often lasted. In fact, most scholars believe it lasted 7 days and nights.
Just like the tribulation will last 7 years.
Just like the tribulation period. And what's interesting is that they have very strict rules about this. Is if you were invited to the wedding, you actually had to go at the beginning. You had to get in before the doors were shut. Again, in the middle of the night. And that's why they blew trumpets when they would go get the bride, because it was to wake the bride and the guests that were ready, and they had their garments. They were ready to go. If you weren't ready to go, you missed that small window.
Just like the parable of the virgins, with their keeping their oil lit.
Exactly. In fact, we even touch on that. Jack Hibbs said something absolutely amazing in the film about the 10 virgins. Okay. And that's why in prophecy and the parable of the 10 virgins, they had to have enough oil. Why? Because it was literally in the middle of the night. That's often when the father would say, go get your bride. It's an amazing thing in Galilee, basically a midnight call wedding.
And so they are taking to the marriage supper, and for 7 days, equal to 7 years, and as the rapture and the tribulation happening, they're protected, they're with God in heaven. But on earth, the tribulation is waged, just like the people who are missing the supper, they're stuck outside. They can't get back in. They have to stay out, right?
Absolutely. The doors would not open. This is something they had strictly adhered to. And if somebody snuck into the wedding, again, this is scripture as well, they weren't wearing the right garments, they were kicked out. Wow. Because that was literally what they did in Galilean weddings. If you weren't invited and you didn't make it in time, you could not come in. And so, Jesus spoke to people on a level that they could easily understand. It wasn't, deep mysteries that you need 4 degrees to. No, everybody understood culturally through his parables and examples of real world life what he was saying. And his Galileans absolutely understood everything he was saying, from his first coming all the way through the age of grace, from the rapture, through the 7-year tribulation, to the wrath being poured out upon the earth. It was all there in their Galilean wedding, in this prophetic wedding timeline, all there, and they understood it.
And we lost all that over time and history, but we go back to the Bible, it's there. So folks, if you're really fascinated, I'm fascinated by this subject, check Before the Wrath. It's a great video, great movie. It's narrated by Kevin Sorbo, and it'll help you understand that there is indeed a rapture of the church, and it will happen before the tribulation.